Hey everybody, I have a new computer to show you guys today. It's a custom build for a friend of mine, and I finished it, I think yesterday. Yeah, I think it was yesterday I finished it. And just to give you a little tour of it. It's a Cube Computer MidTower Deluxe starter. And the reason why I call it the MidTower Deluxe starter is because it's a system that offers decent performance and a very good platform to upgrade upon. And of course in the background is the original MidTower Deluxe. As you can see, it has come a long way over the years. And the biggest improvement I've done to it was the addition of a solid state disk, and it performs absolutely just wonderful. But anyways, we're going to do a tour of the MidTower Deluxe starter today. Now basically this system was built on a tight budget. Buddy of mine ordered the parts. I didn't actually specify what parts for him to get. I furnished the case. The case, the CPU cooler, and a couple other miscellaneous things, and cables, that sort of stuff. He purchased the motherboard, CPU, or APU, memory, power supply, Blu-ray writer, and hard drive. So let's go ahead and have a look inside this thing. And of course you can see why I call it the MidTower Deluxe starter. You got your basic array of components. You have, of course, plenty of power to power some big upgrades in the future. You have an APU based setup, AMD A series. I think it's a 5600K Trinity quad core, socket FM2. Have 2 sticks of DDR3 G-Skill Ripjaws memory. Unfortunately, he only ordered 1066 megahertz memory. Memory that's in the MidTower Deluxe there is 1600, just to give you an idea. But anyways, it's still, does the job. So it's 8 gigs worth, I didn't mention. 2 4GB sticks. He's planning on getting it up to like 16 sometime in the future. Power supply he ordered was a Smart 750. Mine is a modular variant of that. This one's non-modular. And you see I had a bunch of cables to have to deal with. Got most of those out of the way. Many of them are on the other side of the hard drive back there. But most of the cables are zip tied out of the way. There's not that many cables in this system, by the way. You only have 2 SATA cables. A fan, power connection, your LEDs and buttons, 2 USB headers, audio header which was barely long enough to reach the board. That kind of stuff. Here's a look at its motherboard. It's an ASRock Fatality FM2A 88X Plus Killer. And I guess the motherboard gets the killer name from the Killer E2200 network controller that's on it. It's a gigabit controller. I don't know what's so special about it except for the bloatware that it comes with. Which I disabled from starting up with Windows. Seriously, it's a network controller. It's a single gigabit controller. But anyways, I'd say I learned some new things building this thing. And it's kind of crazy how long UEFI has been out, and that kind of wonderful stuff. But I don't get the opportunity to build new computers that often. And I enjoyed building this thing, although it was kind of frustrating in a way. I'll explain that in a moment. And anyways, this is a good looking side. Now I'm going to talk about some of the frustration I had with dealing with this thing. Building the computer was the easy part. I think the hardest part about this ordeal was dealing with all those cables. If he would have ordered the modular variant of that power supply, there's a lot less cables to deal with. But the MidTower Deluxe here, we have a lot more components, so I had to use more cables in this build. But the thing is, all the unneeded cables, or most of the unneeded cables, are still in the box this power supply came in. only the needed cables are plugged in. So, a lot less cables to deal with the exception that this system, as I mentioned, has a lot more hardware. But with this one, obviously, you have all the cables wired in, and you have to deal with those things. And at least they did have sleek-looking wires here, which made it, made them easier to zip tie. And they did give me zip ties, so zip tie everything out of the way. I can't really complain of it. These Thermaltake Smart 70 watt units are relatively nice. I can't complain about them. They're not too expensive either. But anyways, one more look at the motherboard. Now I'm going to talk about installing Windows on this thing. This was more the frustrating ordeal. Buddy chose to put a 3 terabytes hard drive in this thing, and look at the brand he chose. Seagate. I won't be surprised if this thing comes back to me within a year with a bad hard drive. I mean, I'll be honest with you. And many techs noticed too. Seagate has just pretty much went down the toilet. And, in terms of their quality. Or at least on their mechanical drives. Maybe their solid states are good, but, anyways, this drive here works okay right now. But here's the ordeal. And luckily, the motherboard he purchased has UEFI firmware and not your traditional legacy BIOS. Now let me go ahead and talk about this. When you install Windows 7, traditionally, if your system is older and it has a legacy BIOS, it installs in master boot record mode. And if you have a UEFI system, it will boot, using UEFI provided you install it properly. So basically, if you install Windows 7, where you run the installer, and you have a hard drive that's over 2 terabytes, let's say for example 3 terabytes, you go to set up your partitions in the partition setup wizard, and it shows one for 2048 gigabytes and the other one for like 700 something gigabytes. It is stuck in master boot record mode, and it was doing this to me even though I had a UEFI system here, and it was because my install DVD, the one I have that has like all the different versions of Windows 7, had a missing file. It was missing the bootmgr.efi file. But luckily I had an extra Windows 7 DVD laying around. It was for professional 64-bit. It had that file. So when you go to install Windows 7, I think the best way to go about describing this is press the button on your keyboard. It's typically either F11 or F12 to access your boot menu. Select the boot device to boot off of. And on UEFI systems, it will have a prefix of either EFI or UEFI prior to the boot device. For example, the way it works is your system's EFI firmware. When your computer starts, it looks at your boot media and looks for the corresponding EFI files, and so that way when you go to choose a boot device, you'll see the EFI option there. So basically, if you select the option without the prefix, it will boot into master boot record mode, and even if you format your disk and you convert it to GPT, it will not work. Basically, you'll get an error saying that you cannot install Windows on this disk because it is in the GPT partition style. Basically, GPT is required to be able to boot off a drive that is over 2 terabytes in size. Now, on an older system that has legacy BIOS, you can have huge hard drives like this as data drives, but not as your boot partition. Unless, the only way it will work is if your motherboard has UEFI support within its BIOS, with typically the UEFI firmware. If it doesn't, you want to have maybe an alternative boot device for your to boot Windows on. Like, for example, maybe a solid state drive would be a good idea for this. But if you have a system with, you know, UEFI firmware, you should be good to go, provided your Windows 7 DVD is not missing files that are critical to the UEFI working like it's supposed to. But I know I'm rambling on about that, but that was really the biggest hiccup I had in building this thing. You know, it's pretty crazy that, you know, how much things have changed over the past, what, 3 years. Motherboards, you know, see, back in 2010, 2011, most of the motherboards back then still had legacy BIOS. It was, I'd say, around 2012 to 2013 that motherboards really started to show up in the market with UEFI BIOS. You know, especially when Windows 8 come out, because, you know, all these OEM systems with Windows 8 have secure boot. Well, most of them do. Anyways, enough of that. I guess it's time to go ahead and start this thing up and talk a bit more about it. Helps I turn the switch on. This thing might be a little loud at first. Well, not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Now, the loudness here you're hearing is the CPU cooler. The reason why I put that CPU cooler on there like that was to give this thing some future overclocking headroom. Not to mention the AMD A series 5600K, I believe it is. It runs pretty warm. I mean, it runs pretty hot. Initially, I had a cooler that went to the first gen 140 watt Phenom CPU, and with that, the CPU cooler got so hot it was crazy. And this is a 100 watt TDP. Now, normally this is supposed to be a 3.6 gig processor, but I'm noticing that it's actually running at 3.8 gig. I'll show you this EFI utility if you haven't seen one yet. It's different in your legacy BIOS. I mean, it's like having an operating system tied to your motherboard. I mean, you have, with this, you can actually get online and actually chat with HROC's tech support. And you can actually download and update the BIOS using your internet connection from in here. There's a couple of things I mentioned, but it's sort of like your traditional BIOS, with the exception of having a nice graphical user interface. Here you can set your overclock configurations, which, you know, it's funny, this thing is set to auto. And let me see. Yeah, when it's set to auto, pretty much stock, but it's still running the CPU at 3.8 gig when it's a 3.6 gig chip. I mean, hey, it runs fine. I ain't gonna complain. You go to advanced, and you of course have all this stuff here. You have all these tools like System Browser, OMG Online Management Guard, UEFI Tech Service. That's the tech support I was telling you about. Easy RAID Installer, Easy Driver Installer. This is what you use if you don't have an optical disk drive, from what they say in the manual. Here's the EFI update utility. You can do instant flash, like flashing from a USB disk, or you can flash from the internet. And you can configure your network here. Now look at this funny thing. Dehumidifier function. I think this is kind of crazy. It says a dehumidifier function is enabled. The computer will power on automatically to dehumidify the system after entering S4 S5 state. Huh, crazy. Anyways, here's horror monitor. Now, mind you, I have the, I'm well experienced with installing thermal paste. In some cases I do the dot method, in other cases I do the spread. I think I did like a hybrid of the two on this cooler because it's a direct touch. Now this is under full load, and this fan here moves a good bit of air. I mean, I seriously ought to take this fan out because it's really not needed with this guy here, because it just pushes the air out the back of the system. But I guess while I'm at it, here you can see the CPU temp. Let me grab my thermometer, wherever it went, infrared thermometer, and I'm going to probe some things here. This says 35.2 C due to heat pipe. Now this guy here is not 100% accurate, but I'm getting 36.0 on this heat pipe down here, and I'm not sure if it tells you the accuracy or not. But basically I can feel the heat pipes, and they are quite warm to the touch. But anyways, I'm going to go and talk about coolers. I think I mentioned I was going to tell you about that earlier. But this APU does run pretty warm. It has a 100 watt TDP. I mean, a Phenom 2 965 2nd gen has like a 125 watt rating. CPU in the MidTower Deluxe, and its stock configuration is 125 watts. And it actually, even running at 4.2 gigahertz, it actually does run, you know, about that power draw. So the maximum I had was like 116 watts at 42 degrees C under a water cooler. This one is running at 47.5 degrees C at about 100 watt TDP. So I think this air cooler is not doing too bad. But anyways, this is the funny thing. With this guy on here, with the previous fan I had, the stock fan I was on, which didn't move a lot of air, this was running at about 60 degrees C or 58 degrees C. And it wasn't due to improper installation. These heat pipes were burning hot to the touch. It was the CPU, the APU was literally maxing out this guy here. And this is for a Phenom 140 watt. Yeah, first gen Phenom 140 watt chip. Now I did replace that fan, and with this loud fan running maxed out, it did drop the temperature down to about 50 degrees C or 52 degrees C. And this fan here is not even running nearly as fast as it can. I'd say it's only running about 40% of its max speed. That's a Sanyo San Ace 92mm on that cooler. But anyways, so you hear how I'm explaining how hot this thing was running with this. And you see, it's with this fan at 2556 RPMs, we're running at 48.5 degrees C under max load. This is the factory boxed cooler that came with that chip. Look how tiny it is. I mean, it's pitiful. Look at this. Isn't that awful? This is exactly the same size cooler that you get with a Phenom 2 905E. You know, the really power efficient 65 watt quad that AMD sold back in 2009. And actually, I have that cooler in service in the TV box, and these coolers are decent for, you know, basic end chips that don't put out a lot of heat. I mean, it's designed to disperse heat pretty well, and you know, it's got the fans around, you know, like this. But I mean, seriously, this APU runs hot with a runs pretty warm with, you know, heat pipe coolers installed. I'd hate to imagine how hot it would have ran with this. As you can see, I chose not to even install this. I mean, that's awful. As a matter of fact, I'm going to link you in a video. I'm going to put a link in the description for a video I posted in 2009 about AMD coolers. You got to watch that. Anyways, let's go and get out of this utility and go back into Windows 7 one more time. Yeah, this is getting to be pretty long. Fan sped up just a little bit. Now, a buddy of mine, he doesn't care about noise. And I'm not the biggest fan of the fan control on this motherboard either, to be honest with you. I'm going to put the cover back on this system and see how it sounds with the side panel on. Now I must say, when it kicks that fan on to max speed, it really cools down that CPU. And if you're wondering, the heat pipe cooler that I used is a Rocketfish Universal CPU cooler. I think Best Buy still sells those. I'm not 100% sure though. Don't quote me on it. But it's a Cooler Master manufactured cooler. I gotta redo this side panel while I shut it down, but anyways, this is how it sounds with the side panel on. Not too bad. And here's a look at the included utility that comes with this motherboard. I think it's pretty nice. You have operation mode, you have tools. You know, a lot of stuff that you access in the UEFI utility can be accessed here. Here's the overclock tweaker, which I recommend going into the UEFI utility to mess with overclocking and that kind of stuff. It does have a nice hardware monitor. Again, if I didn't mention before, which I believe I did, look at the CPU frequency, 3.8 gigahertz. Motherboard's fresh out of the box. And the CPU obviously is fresh out of the box. CPU is at 41 degrees C, and it's actually pretty warm in this room. And as I mentioned, that APU does run pretty warm. But this utility gives you, lots of info. Here's that tech service thing and settings, and boy, that's a lot of settings there. You got all to run at Windows startup. Anyways, basically here we have Windows 7 Pro 64-bit, and basically what Buddy's going to be doing with this thing, he's going to be he will be using this with his TV. He's got a big high-def TV. And it's going to be a nice system for him. Now, I'm not exactly sure how much he spent on the hardware, but yeah, I think a setup like this will be a good starting point to make you a nice system. I mean, later on he can add in extra memory, graphics card, and whatnot, and have fun with it. So yeah, video might be a little long, but yeah, anyways, and shut down. That was a tour of a system I built, and I called it the Cube Computer MidTower Deluxe Starter. Even got a decal up here. And I must say, a Brother laser printer does a very good job printing out these printing out this stuff when you have it full of toner. So anyways, any questions or comments, feel free to ask, and thanks for watching. And I will end this with a look at the MidTower Deluxe.